Well, I'm only in 5th grade, so I don't know if that's important.
Doing good.
Well, one of them gave an offering, didn't they, that God didn't like?
Yeah.
That always concerned me.
Yeah, that's right. You're exactly right. One gave an offering of an animal, and the other one gave an offering of vegetation, and God was well pleased with one of them, right? You remember who that was?
He was pleased with
Abel. Pleased with Abel. And Cain was jealous because of that and killed his brother. Can you imagine such a thing? Killing your own brother. Okay, I think we're good now. China, I apologize. We're going to pick up right here. So the Lord created, let's go back to the idea of stewardship. The Lord created the earth. He handed over its care to, yes, that is very good. So, but notice that as the first line in Article 13 says, God was the source of the blessings. He was the creator. And, I think it would really put a new perspective on our life if we saw everything that we possess as God's. And He gives it to us. We're only on this earth for a short period of time. He gives us those things, whether it be tangible things or our children, our friends, whatever. He gives us these things so that we can invest in those and be good stewards of what the Lord has provided us with. I think we'd be more grateful, don't you? We'd be more thankful as men and women if we understood that God was the one who really blessed us with these things. The next line in Article 13 says that Christians have a spiritual debtorship to the whole world, a holy trusteeship in the gospel, and a binding stewardship in their possession. What is that all about? 3 things, right? First, we have a spiritual debtorship to the whole world. And I'm reminded here of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 20. Chris, if you would read that to us real quick.
For you were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's.
Right. So, of course, in this context, Paul is talking about sexual purity. And he's borrowing the language really of prostitution. He's saying you have been bought not as a prostitute for the service of sex stuff, but you have been bought at a price by the Lord. He has bought you out of your wickedness and your sin. And He's done it through an important price, a high price, the price of His blood. Jesus died on the cross so that you and I could be purchased out of sin and out of hell and out of death and brought into His marvelous light. So since you and I have done that, and we are now Christians, we belong to Jesus rather than ourselves. He is now our Lord. And since we belong to Jesus, He desires that we have the same mind as Him. And so we look at others as Jesus looks at others. That's what we've been called to do. I mentioned this in my sermon last Sunday. I have to pray, Lord, give me your eyes. Because if I depend on my vision, remember I talked about how the people in Laodicea had that eye salve that they sold around the world, and Jesus says, you need to put on my eye salve. Why? So that I can see like Jesus sees. And if I'm like that, then I'm going to be generous. I'm going to be considerate. I'm going to be kind to others, just like my Lord was to me. Being spiritual debtors in this world means that we too will sacrifice the things God has given us so that more and more people can know about the love of Jesus. It's worth it to sacrifice like that. Look at what Paul writes in Romans 1. Romans 1, verses 14 and 15. Do I not have it?
No, it's okay.
Oh.
I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to unwise. So, as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also.
So he talks there about spiritual debtorship. I have a debt that's on my life. And the way that I'm paying this debt is by preaching the gospel. That's how Paul was gifted. He was gifted as an apostle to preach the gospel and to evangelize. Not all of us have that gift, but what God has given you, I am, to be good stewards, good managers, of what He has given us. Again, it would have been horrible for Paul to go, hey, you know what? God has gifted me as an apostle. He's gifted me as a preacher. He's gifted me as someone who can tell others about Jesus, but instead I'm just going to go sit at home. That would have been horrible. And if you've been gifted with the gift of administration, we'll say, and God has allowed you an understanding of how to get things done, and then you say, I know how to get things done, and God's given me this special ability, but you know what? I'm just going to sit at home. That's squandering what God has given you. That's not being a good steward. That's not being this spiritual debtor that he's talking, or that this is talking about here. Second, Christians have a holy trusteeship in the gospel. Now, what's a trustee? Can someone explain what a trustee is?
Someone that guards something.
Well, yeah, you can kind of say that. Do we have any trustees here? No?
The church has a trustee.
Well, so what is a trustee?
The one who's responsible for the formal and legal aspects of the church.
Exactly. Someone who has a legal obligation to administer someone else's possessions. So, Brother Bob is a trustee. He is not the owner of what he's doing, but he has been selected with 2 other people in our church to be our legal representative if we ever need a legal representative, like for signing contracts and things like that. We trust him to carry out these legal obligations. So, apply that same idea to what it's talking about here. We must be ready to invest the gospel freely, but also prudently. You're a trustee, a spiritual trustee. Invest the gospel freely, but prudently. Jesus, in one parable, talks about sowing seed, broadcasting seed, and doing it indiscriminately. Just remember that? The sower went out to sow and he just sowed it. Didn't matter where it landed, some on the stony ground, some on the thorny ground, some on the road, some in the good soil. But then he also said in another place, don't cast your pearls before swine. So it's like there's a balance between doing it freely, doing it generously, but also not letting it somehow distort the gospel and the purity of the gospel message. Yes, Kyle.
Possibly a distinction I've heard taught, the seed being the kingdom of heaven, right? But pearls being referred to wisdom. So I could see, one saying, I'm going to spread the gospel, the message of Jesus and the kingdom of God, but trying to impart wisdom that doesn't make sense to someone who's not been regenerated in mind may not be as applicable.
Yeah,
in
yeah,
that case.
I can see that. And you see that really when you try to have a gospel or talk about the Bible with someone who's lost, and there's a veil or a boundary there sometimes.
I think the continuation of the verse is, lest they turn and attack you.
Yes, or chew it up.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. But I also think that this idea of being a trustee means we take it seriously, the gospel. And not just the gospel, but the Christian witness. We take it seriously so that we are very, very generous and we're very free, but we also have to be very careful with what we have. And so I like that balance. Balance is a word that is not used enough in the church. It's like all or nothing. I go on to YouTube. Anybody else ever go on to YouTube? Okay, yeah, you don't have to admit it here. But I go on to the YouTube, and the thing about the YouTube is it's got this algorithm. And I don't know who comes up with the algorithm, but it tells me, hey, Robby, you need to watch this video. And so there's a lot of stuff on there about Alabama football. I have no idea how YouTube knows I like Alabama football, but it's all over there. And then there's stuff about weather, because I enjoy following the weather, all over the weather. And then there are church things, church services. And here's what I've noticed. Half of the things that come up on my algorithm that are large church things are like really, really seeker friendly. I watched one just yesterday of a church in Florida called Church by the Glades, I think it's called. This church is so wild. They had, on Sunday, they had the Addams family. Anybody familiar with the Addams family? They had the Addams family during worship. Like people dressed up as the Addams family. And they had singing, I guess praise and worship, with Wednesday Addams dancing around to Lady Gaga. I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding you. And then the preacher got up to preach. And he said, "Oh, I forgot my Bible." And Cousin It walked onto the stage and gave the man his Bible. And I'm like, wow, that's an extreme. But then I've also got some churches that pop up on my thing that are prominent where, I mean, they're talking in a different language that nobody speaks anymore. Latin. They're speaking in Latin. Nobody. What are you saying? I can't even understand. And people go to that service, and it's like, what about balance? Let's have some balance here. Let's not have Cousin It on stage. But let's also speak so that people can hear us and understand what we have to say, you know. And I think that's a good outlook for the Christian life. And certainly when it comes to stewardship, balance is so key. Third, Christians have a binding stewardship in their possessions. So we must understand that everything we have ultimately does not belong to us. In one day, Job lost all of his possessions. Remember that? Everything, or most likely everything. And at the end of it all, in one day, there's just one tragedy on top of another. At the end of it all, this is what he says in Job 1, verses 20 and 21.
Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head. And he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord."
Now, I mentioned just a moment ago how it would make such a big difference in our lives if we understood that God, as the Creator, is ultimately the owner of everything in our possession. It's not really ours, but He has given it to us as stewards. What difference would it make if I saw my bank account, whether it's big or little, if I saw my bank account not as my money, but God's money? Or if I saw my home or my car not as mine, but as God's? Would I be more likely to be generous with the money if I saw it as God's? Would I be more likely to be hospitable in my home if I saw it as God's house? You see? So it just changes your whole perspective when you look at things like this. God...
At the very least, you'd consult Him. Because you can't spend what's not yours.
If you're a good steward, you're going to talk to the manager about it. That's right. Or the boss. You're going to talk to the owner about what you're managing. That's right.
It's a lot easier to spend somebody else's money too.
That
My kids know that.
yeah, they do. You're right about that. There's some folks in this church that know that too, Gary, when it comes to our budget. Nobody in this room is like that, but you know, it doesn't. So because of all these things, we believe that we are under obligation to serve Him with our time, talents, material possessions, and should recognize all these as entrusted to us to use for the glory of God and for helping others. Now, I've always been attracted to that three-part division of things that we steward. What are they, Gary? They all start with the letter T.
Time, talents, and material possessions, but I don't know what the other T would be.
Treasure.
Treasure, okay.
Time, talent, and treasure. These are all things God has gifted us with so that we can use them for His kingdom and to help others in their need. So I've noticed that while we have a limited amount of each one of those things, different people have different amounts. So, all right, if you think about it, I'll just write it here on the board. Time, talent, and treasure. if you think about it, at different stages of your life, you're going to have different amounts of these things. So I'm speaking in generalities here, very generally speaking. When you're younger, when you're a young adult, do you have a lot of time?
Yep.
Do you have a lot of talent? And when I write talent, I mean
Energy.
ability. Ability. Do you have a lot of ability when you're young? Treasure. Do you have a lot of that?
No.
Probably not when you're young. I mean, when you first start starting in life, you probably don't have a lot of that. All right, now when you're middle-aged, do you have a lot of time when you're middle-aged? You got kids that are in your house and they're ankle biters and all that stuff? No. You got to go to work to pay for all of it, so you don't have as much time. What about ability? That starts to decline the older you get, right? Treasure, you might have more of that than you did when you were a young adult. In fact, anybody ever read C.S. Lewis' Screwtape Letters? I remember the uncle says at one point that you should strike, he's talking, the demons talking to each other. You should strike him in his middle-age prosperity. And that's always stuck with me. So when we're middle-aged, we tend to have more treasure. What about when you're older? When you're retired? Do you have more time as a retiree?
Yep.
Especially if you can stay out of the doctor's office. Once you get into that cycle, man, you go to the doctor 3 times a week, 4 times a week, and it's crazy for doctors.
It's either that or funerals.
Or funerals. But you have generally more time. Brother Aaron retired, and this man has less time than anyone I know now because he is always in action preaching the gospel. Talent, ability, as you get older, maybe your ability to do physical things declines, but your ability to do other things increases, like be a good counselor, be someone who's there for others. Treasure. Maybe some people when they're older have money. Most people don't. They have a fixed income. They have to be very, very careful with their money. It changes with age. The question is what you have. And by the way, there are some people who would give everything they've got to have a little more time. So if you're wealthy in time today, you've got something very good. You've got a great gift. Don't squander it. And if you have resources and you can give more to help people and you can give more to build the kingdom, don't squander it. And if you have abilities, like I said earlier, whether it's administration, preaching, evangelism, I don't care what it is, don't squander it. God has given this to you to be a good steward. And we're under obligation to serve Him. But in all of this, what the Lord is concerned about is, are we good stewards of what we do have? No matter your age, no matter how much of which of these you've got, are you a good steward of it? Because that's what we're going to have to give an account for when we stand before God. He's going to want to know, what did you do with what I gave you? And if the answer is, I watched a lot of football and, just sort of hung out, or I worked too much and never got to do anything for the ministry because I was money hungry, that's not going to cut it before God. He cares about what we do with what He gives us. So I was thinking, the widow's mite mattered to Jesus. The young family that gives up a Saturday morning to serve in ministry, that matters to Jesus. They don't have a lot of time. That matters to Jesus. The senior adult who goes on the mission trip and provides food for those who are able to go out and do the other things on the trip, that matters to Jesus. What you have, God has gifted you with. Be a good steward of whatever it is. Now I'm preaching. I shouldn't have preached just then, so forgive me. Article 13 concludes.
Brother Robby.
Yes, Gary.
So, what you just mentioned as far as what do you do with your life after you get saved, basically?
Yes.
Are you going to spend your time, talent, and treasure for eternal things versus worldly things?
Yeah.
One of my favorite verses is out of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where it talks about, are you building upon the foundation of your salvation of Jesus Christ with wood, hay, or stubble, or with silver and gold, which will all be purged by the fire of judgment. And this is not for salvation, because you've already been saved because of the foundation of Christ. But what do you do with your life after you get saved?
Right, that's it. So are you investing in things that are eternal, that are of great value, or things that are not? John Piper, love him or like him, John Piper famously said, talked about reading through the Reader's Digest. This was 20 plus years ago. And in Reader's Digest, it talked about a retired couple who was spending all of their time and all of their resources traveling to beaches collecting seashells. And he was talking to young adults in this sermon, this very famous sermon, and he said, "Is that what you want for your life? Is that really what, I mean, this is what they lived for. They collected money down through the years, gave a lot of time and energy into making enough to retire at a certain age so that they could go collect seashells? What a waste of a life." And then he wrote a book called Don't Waste Your Life, which is all about God's given us the ability to invest in His kingdom's work. And that's far more valuable than seashells that we can collect. I don't know who that couple was, but I wonder if they're embarrassed by that whole thing.
I'm willing to bet they are.
I bet. Right on the money. Okay, Article 13 concludes by saying, according to the Scriptures, Christians should contribute of their means cheerfully, regularly, systematically, proportionately, and liberally for the advancement of the Redeemer's cause on the earth. So let's talk about these adverbs. The first one, we should contribute cheerfully for the Redeemer's cause. Of course, when you think of cheerful giving, there's one passage that comes to mind. Brother Chris,
God's a cheerful giver.
you got it.
Do I have to say it?
Yes.
So that each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver.
That's it. God loves a cheerful giver. And you know, when Paul wrote that, the context was that he was going to come through Corinth, and when he arrived, he was going to take up an offering for saints in Jerusalem and Judea who were in a terrible famine. And so he's telling the church, and Corinth was a wealthy town. It was kind of like Huntsville. You know, Huntsville has all these scientists and stuff, and we're just a wealthier town than many cities. That was Corinth. And so he's telling this church, which probably had several wealthy people in it, y'all give generously to these saints who are in the Holy Land because they need it. But then he goes on to stress, don't do it out of compulsion. Don't do it because I'm telling you you have to do it. Do it out of your heart. For God loves a cheerful giver. It's hard to be cheerful if somebody's holding a gun to your head telling you you must give, right? It's like I thought before, I cheerfully am able to give to an offering that goes to help someone in need. I'm not able to cheerfully give to Uncle Sam on April 15th. That makes me unhappy when I have to do that. But I love to give to those who are in need where the gospel can be proclaimed. That's a good kind of giving. God loves a cheerful giver. One thing we learn in the New Testament is that God knows the condition of our hearts. I want everybody to get out of this mindset that God's in heaven, with a list going, all right, how much did Gary give? 9.5%. Gary, that's a check against.
I'm saved by grace, not by works.
That's right. He's not up there keeping tally. He cares about the heart. You can give perfect.
He loves you to quote him back to you.
He knows your heart. So when the Pharisees and the others gave to the offering at the temple, and they did it so that everybody knew, right? When they'd throw that coin in and they could hear it rattling down the thing and everybody knew, that was for their own self-glorification. He says in Matthew 6, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, or vice versa. I always get those mixed up. What he means is when you give, do it secretly. Do it so that people don't see it, and so that even you yourself don't really think about you're a great person or whatever. It should be done with a purity in your heart, because God knows your heart. And if all you can give is $1 and you give it, God knows that. And He honors that. If all you've got is one night a week to give to a study in the Bible, God knows that. And He loves that. He knows your heart, is what I'm getting at here.
Brother Robby,
Yes, sir.
along those lines, doing the right thing for the wrong reasons is wrong. 1 Corinthians chapter 12,
I don't recall those exact words.
which basically Paul, or maybe 13,
Okay.
maybe. Paul,
Oh, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels but have not love, that
right,
passage.
if I'm doing all this great stuff and I don't have love, I'm a clanging gong and empty cymbal.
Yeah,
So that's doing the right thing for the wrong reasons.
I got you.
It's wrong.
That'd be a good title of a sermon on 1 Corinthians 13. I love it. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said that if you're giving an offering and you remember that you have a problem with your brother, not necessarily literally physical brother, but just someone else, leave your gift at the altar, go and be reunited with the person that you've got an issue with, then come back and offer. Why? Because God's not interested in the offering. He's interested in the heart. That's what He cares about. Giving out of compulsion or fear, giving expecting something in return. A lot of people give so that they, as though God is like a cosmic IRA. And, if you invest in it now, He gives later, tax-free. And that's just not how God works. And that's not how the Christian life works. He wants us to give with a cheerful heart. Second, Christians should contribute of their means regularly. So, the Old Testament is filled with regular offerings. And you never appeared before God in worship without one. In the New Testament, there is, and Kyle, you may be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this. In the New Testament, there is only one Old Testament offering that is maintained in the church. And it's the offering of praise. Hebrews chapter 13. The offering of praise. Which means that when we come into the sanctuary, we should offer God our praise. Fruit from our lips, not from our land, but from our lips. And that is, still to this day, God says, when you come before me, you must bring something. And we take an offering during the morning service of money, but even more important than that is the offering of praise that we give with our lips in the worship service. We should do this regularly. Yes.
Amazing how pretty singing is in the congregation.
It is.
I mean, just to listen to it is,
It is.
it's really unusually good.
There's something spiritual about it.
Yes.
On Sunday, I know Miss Pat, you're in the praise team. You might not be able to hear it, but there are a couple of little girls
I do hear them.
who sing when they know the song. They sing at the top of their lungs, and it just fills the sanctuary. And I love it. I love it so much.
Well, they loved you on Sunday because they were sitting right behind me.
Oh, really?
Well, that country song about something about a Sunday morning,
Yeah.
and can you imagine walking by a church and your heart all heavy
Yeah.
and hear that singing?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's like heaven, which is the way it's supposed to be. Real quick on the regular issue, 1 Corinthians 16:2, if you would read that, Chris.
On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come.
So this is another one of those gifts to those who are suffering in Judea. And so Paul's going to come eventually to the church, and he says, go ahead and lay up some money every week. Regular giving. When you come together on the Lord's Day, regularly give. It should be a regular part of our lives, giving. Third, Christians should contribute of their means systematically. One of the things that I counsel young people when they're going through premarital counseling, we always have a session on finances. And I always say, I always have them make me a budget, like a mock budget. And Of course, everybody needs a budget, but especially if you're a young couple, you got to have that. And I always ask them after they bring it in, I say, what's the first thing on the budget? And usually it's house or paying back loans or things like this. I say, no. The first thing has to be your offering. That's the first thing. And what I recommend is a tithe, 10%. Just give 10% to the Lord's use. And I say, and I truly believe this, the amazing thing is, if you honestly tithe, everything that comes after it works itself out. You're less likely to waste your money then, because you have spent the first amount, the first 10%, investing it into God's kingdom. And then somehow, I'm not telling you that God multiplies it in some magical way. I'm just saying it changes your outlook on the rest of it, so that you're not squandering it on whatever. It's amazing how it can help you, as Brother Sonny said earlier, be disciplined with what God has given you to do. That is systematic. You have to have that in your life, that ordering of priorities.
Brother Robby,
Yes.
does the verse kind of say give the first fruits?
It does, yes.
So I'm not a farmer, and I know Bob here, he raises tomatoes, but, I guess there's an act of faith there, because if you get a crop, you're sort of giving out of what you're anticipating coming,
Yes.
as opposed to, okay, here I am at the end of the month, I know what I got. Now, God, I'll give you your 10%.
That's right.
So that's a little bit different attitude too. It's like, okay, I'm gonna give you what comes up first,
Yes.
in anticipation that you will continue to bless me beyond that.
Because it absolutely is that. It shows faith.
Yeah,
It's an act of faith. And it also declares everything that comes after this is God's work in my life. Very important that we do that with what He's given us. And not just give Him the leftovers,
yeah.
as you say.
And Brother Robby, one of the verses in there is Malachi chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always loved that passage in there, because I've heard it said, and I've studied it extensively, that this is the only place, at least one of the only places, where this is quoting God and Him saying, do this, He says, test me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's exactly, it's not just the bring it first, it's the bring the whole thing
Mm-hmm.
to me first, because it says to bring the entire, the full tithe
Mm-hmm.
into the storehouse.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that goes along with, yes, bring it first, bring the whole thing first, though. Don't
Right.
just give me a piece of it, because back to the same of a manager versus an owner. It's not yours.
It's the Lord's
It's
anyway.
mine.
Yeah.
Bring it back. I'm not telling you to bring me everything. I'm just telling you to bring me the whole tithe.
Yeah.
And I like the next verse after that. He says, and He will destroy the devourer
Yeah.
of our income. And we'll have a lot of devourers of our income.
Mhm.
Yes.
And to think how God is going to protect us from that.
Yeah. It's amazing the difference that you have when you worship the Lord with your means. And that's what a tithe is meant to be. It's not checking a list and saying, I gave again. It's certainly not earning your salvation. Far from it. It's honoring the Lord with what He's given us for the use of His church, which is what we do. And that brings up another thing when it comes to systematic giving, is that a church has to have a budget. And our church has a budget. Miss Pat, we spend a lot of time and energy on that budget, don't we? Because we care. Miss Pat's the financial wizard of our church.
No.
Well,
Just a steward.
just a student, that's right. Well, she's certainly the chair of our finance committee, and we are always very concerned with this because we want to be good stewards, which means we have to find that balance between being too reckless, which some churches are with the resources they have, but then also not be so stingy that all we do is lay it up in the bank, right? Stewardship.
And And Sherwood is a good steward.
I believe so.
It is good.
I believe so.
Are you talking about balanced?
Yes,
That's what
that's the word. That's my word.
Balance, not in the red.
No, you don't. That's right. You don't want to be in the red. Fourth.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Sissy.
I just wanted to say that, like with the tithing, I think that's true. And like I heard a pastor one time say, if there's something in your life that you need more of, whether it be time or talent or money, give that to God, and you'll see how He multiplies that.
Yeah.
So if you need more time and you're like, I just don't have enough hours in the day, well, give some of that time to God, and you'll see
Yeah.
how much more time you have.
You saying that reminds me of Martin Luther. And yesterday was Reformation Day, which on October 31st of 1517, so 506 years ago, Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg, Germany, where he was a monk. And that sparked the Protestant Reformation. We are here today because of what started on that day. So Reformation Day. Martin Luther would start every morning with prayer. And he said the more he had to do in a day, the more time he would spend praying. Now that seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? It would seem like the more you got to do, the less you should spend in prayer. But he had the opposite view. He said, no, I need to give God even more of my attention because I've got more to do today. So that kind of goes along with it.
Steward today.
That's right. Okay, fourth, Christians should contribute of their means proportionately. And this goes back to what I was talking about a minute ago as far as the different stages of life and how we have different elements available to us at different stages. We have to give in a proportionate manner so that the kingdom can grow.
To whom much is given, much is required.
That's right. That sounds like somebody in the Bible too. If you're given a lot, you have to be required of that which you've been given. You know what? That's a good point, Gary. Because, well, going back to that widow and her mite, she didn't have a lot, did she? But Jesus noticed her gift. You know?
Proportionally, she gave a lot.
Proportionately,
What her income was.
I mean, if she gave 2 small copper coins, and that's all she had to live on, the Bible says. If she had given 1 coin, that's 50%. That's a gigantic gift. And I've had this conversation with others before. If I were there that day in the temple, I would have been like, sweetie, don't do that. You can get a hamburger or something with that. Don't put that in there. They're going to waste it anyway. This is a corrupt temple organization. They're just going to waste it on their own desire. That's part of Jesus' point, by the way, because right before that happened, he said that these guys here devour widows' houses, and then literally she's giving all her stuff to them. But again, God is concerned about this, the heart. And so that's what he saw in her. She gave more, he said, than they gave. Proportionally, she gave more. To whom much is given, much is required. Fifth, Christians should contribute of their means liberally. And this is not, of course, political. It's about giving.
Freely.
Freely, openly, generously, we might say. Christians should be the last people on the face of the earth who are stingy. Whether it's our money or time, whatever. We should be the last people on earth who are stingy. We've been given so much. And so now we're called to give back what He's given to us. We should be willing to give all of that so that God might be glorified and others might be helped. Now, notice in all of this that we've talked about, from the faith and message, in fact, Adam, can you go back to the very beginning slide that shows the faith and message? Notice what word is not on this chart, in this faith and message article. It's a word that begins with T.
Tithe.
Yes. There's nothing about a tithe there. Why? Why nothing about the tithe? Well, where's our command to tithe found, Nikki? You read it a second ago.
No, it was in the Old Testament in
Malachi. Yes, Malachi. Malachi is where it's found. Well, it's found also in Leviticus, but it's found in the Old Testament. And by Malachi's period, what was happening was the whole system was corrupt. That the priests were, well, the sacrifices that were being made were half-baked sacrifices. Instead of bringing God their best animals, they would bring Him the ones that were lame and old and messed up. God said, no, you bring me your best, not your leftovers. But then also the priests were corrupt. And because tithes weren't being brought to the storehouse as they were supposed to, that meant that the Levites, who were the ones who helped the priest in the sacrifices, they didn't have food. Because unlike the other tribes of Israel, the Levites didn't have a possession of land. And so they relied on the giving of the community to feed themselves, right? So the whole system had broken down and was messed up in Malachi's day, and it all centered around their greed, their unwillingness to be good stewards. And they were robbing God in the process. How do you rob God? That's the rhetorical question of Malachi 3. How do you rob God? By not bringing your tithes into the storehouse. This is how you rob God. So, it's Old Testament, and it's not the only sacrifice that is mentioned in the Old Testament, is it? There are many, many other sacrifices. According to Alan Ross, who is my Old Testament professor in school, it was for the average person about 45% of your yearly income would go to tithes and offerings. That's for the average person. The poorer you were, the less was required. And if you didn't have any land at all to grow anything or to have any livestock, you could actually go onto other people's property and get from them. That was the story of Boaz and Ruth, right? She went on his property and was able to, and he was a very generous steward. And that led to the two of them getting together in the book of Ruth. And then out of that union comes a child, and out of that child comes another child, and then you have Jesse, the great king of Israel, who comes from that. And it all started because this man was a good steward and generous in what he had. He went above the tithe in letting her eat from not just the corners of his field, but he gave specifically to her and her mother-in-law. That's a good example of how we should give. So the tithe is good. It's a good baseline. That's what I say. It's biblical, and it's a good baseline. But there are always going to be opportunities to give more. I'm talking about money. There are always going to be opportunities to give more. When it comes to our time, there are always going to be opportunities to give more. When it comes to our abilities, there are always going to be opportunities to give more. God's church requires us in the body to be willing to sacrifice. And again, if you hear nothing else I've said tonight, hear me on this. It all goes back to the heart. If I think to myself, Lord, this is not mine. I mean, there's nothing in it anyway. It's all on plastic now, but this is not mine. This is yours. It changes everything. And it means that I'm going to pay my bills. And it means that I'm going to take care of my family. And it means that, yes, in my case, I'm going to maybe buy a pint of ice cream on occasion because I like ice cream and I don't think that's a waste of money. But it also means that I'm going to be generous. And I'm that way not just, I have to be that way, not just with my stuff, but also with my energy and my time. Okay? All right. I hate talking about stewardship, but I'm glad we did. Yes, sir.
So in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we have a list of spiritual gifts.
Sure.
And one of those is giving. Does that mean that some people are more prone to give liberally
Yes.
than others?
Yes, I believe so. And I've known people like this who are. I could even name somebody. I know that you all know in this room. I'm not going to do that because don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. I don't want them to get their treasure here on earth because they're laying it up in heaven where moth and rust does not destroy. Thieves do not break in and steal. Fire cannot destroy. But yes, Gary, I think so. I think some people are just gifted with the gift of generosity and giving. And maybe God has given them more resources tangibly in this life to do that. But that doesn't mean that they're the only ones who are supposed to give. It also says that in Ephesians chapter 4 that He gave some to be evangelists. Does that mean that only those people should tell others about the gospel? Of course not. We should all do that. But I think you would agree that Billy Graham was more gifted at preaching the gospel than maybe you. But he was faithful with that. And now we're faithful with what we have. So, yes, there are some who are gifted in giving.
I think I've heard it before, and correct me if I'm wrong on it, the definition of being generosity, being generous. It's to give without expecting something in return.
Yeah, that's good.
So, like to donate, $20 and you get a free T-shirt. That's not generous giving because you're getting something in return.
Right.
But whenever I think that's the significance of like the widows and the orphans. You're doing something for someone who has nothing to give back to you. There's absolutely no expectation, no possibility of a return in that. So yeah, I think that's true, that some people are they're more generous than others.
God has given them that
Yeah.
outlook. All right, any other comment or question before we close? If not, Adam, we can turn it off. Good night.